To my family, I was just dependable Clara, the one who quietly managed the finances for their sprawling but struggling estate, year after draining year. "Clara will sort it," they'd murmur, never looking up from their lavish plans. They saw the dutiful daughter, the silent cog in their gilded machine. But they never wondered what I wrote in my other ledger. This year, the annual family council wouldn't be about their allowances. It would be about the empire I'd secretly built right under their noses, and the choice they were about to be forced to make. My days at Ashworth Estate usually began with the scent of damp stone and old polish, a smell as familiar as my own skin. From the small east-facing window of my office, a converted linen closet really, I'd watch the mist burn off the sprawling, untamed gardens. For 30 years I've been Clara Ashworth, the quiet one, the keeper of ledgers, the solver of inconvenient financial truths for a family that preferred to live in the sunnier climes of past glories. "Clara will handle it," was the refrain, a gentle dismissal that allowed them to continue their luncheons and idle pursuits, blissfully unaware of the crumbling foundations beneath their feet, both literal and fiscal. I was the steady, predictable hum in the background of their more flamboyant lives, the one who made sure the bills somehow got paid. The meticulously kept accounts of Ashworth Estate, with its leaking roofs and entitled descendants, told a story of slow, inevitable decline. I charted every penny, every frantic loan application, every politely worded deferral request to increasingly impatient creditors. My brothers, Alistair and Julian, and my sister Beatrice, floated through life with an inherited sense of importance that the family's actual bank balance could no longer support. They saw me as a fixture, as much a part of Ashworth as the ancient oaks lining the drive. Always there, always reliable, never questioning. Perhaps it's a common story. The quiet ones in a family often carry the heaviest, unseen burdens. The strength it takes to manage chaos while appearing serene is a superpower in itself. Does my story make you think of someone in your own life? Someone whose quiet dedication holds things together? I'd be genuinely moved to hear about them in the comments below. My office, though small, was my sanctuary. The ledgers, filled with my neat, precise script, were a testament to my diligence, or so they thought. They'd see the official Ashworth books, the ones detailing the dwindling returns from the tenant farms and the ever-increasing costs of maintaining a history no one could truly afford anymore. They'd pat my shoulder. "Good work, Clara, keeping us afloat," Alistair would boom, before asking for an advance on his stipend to fund another ill-advised business venture. Beatrice would breeze in, smelling of expensive perfume, to lament the state of the conservatory roof, conveniently forgetting she'd insisted on importing rare orchids the previous spring, the cost of which had eaten into the repair fund. Julian, the youngest and most charmingly irresponsible, usually just needed a top-up for his artistic endeavors in the city. Their requests were always couched in the language of necessity, their needs paramount. It never occurred to them to ask how these miracles were performed, how the electricity stayed on, or how the ancient boiler was coaxed into life each winter. They simply assumed it was my duty, my purpose, and for a long time, I let them. I was the youngest, the one who'd stayed behind while they'd all flown off to boarding schools and grand tours, only to return when their wings were clipped by reality, expecting the nest to be as comfortable as ever. I learned early that my value was in my utility, my silence, my ability to absorb their anxieties and make them disappear, or at least postpone them. But what they never saw, what they never even conceived of, was the other set of ledgers. Tucked away, not in the dusty estate office, but in my small cottage on the far edge of the property, a dwelling they considered quaintly rustic and suitably out of the way for dear, practical Clara, was where my real work happened. Under now, the soft glow of a single desk lamp, long after the main house had fallen into its usual boozy, self-congratulatory silence, I built something else. Something entirely mine. It started small, a cautious investment here, a shrewd land acquisition there, leveraging the forgotten corners of knowledge I'd gleaned from poring over Ashworth's historical documents, identifying undervalued assets, others overlooked. The initial ventures were terrifying. Every penny was a risk, scraped from the meager salary the estate afforded me, a salary they often forgot to pay on time. But with each small success, a confidence began to bloom within me, a feeling entirely separate from the weary resignation that characterized my days serving Ashworth. I learned to read the markets, to anticipate trends, to negotiate with a quiet tenacity that would have astounded my blustering brothers. They saw Clara, the mousy accountant. The world of finance, the one I was secretly navigating, saw a mind as sharp and unyielding as winter frost. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very skills I used to prop up their decaying legacy were the same ones I was using to forge a new one for myself. This meticulous, clandestine operation grew year by year. While they debated the merits of reupholstering the drawing room sofas in silk or damask, I was finalizing deals on commercial properties in burgeoning city districts, investing in tech, startups they'd never heard of, and quietly acquiring shares in sustainable energy projects. My personal portfolio, the one documented in those secret ledgers, began to dwarf the entire net worth of Ashworth Estate. The numbers, in their beautiful, stark clarity, told a story of ascent, of power accrued through patience, intelligence, and an almost monastic dedication. It was a silent rebellion, waged in spreadsheets and late-night phone calls to brokers on different continents. The turning point, the moment I knew the charade had to end, came during last year's family council. It was a particularly grim meeting. The latest harvest had been poor, a major tenant had defaulted, and Alistair, with his usual impeccable timing, had managed to lose a significant sum, money borrowed from the estate's emergency fund, on a racehorse that predictably came in last. The air was thick with their manufactured despair and thinly veiled accusations. Clara, my eldest brother, sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. We simply must find more money. The West Wing roof is about to collapse. Surely you can rearrange things? Perform one of your little miracles? Beatrice chimed in. And the winter ball, it's tradition. We can't possibly cancel that. What would people say? It was the casual, unthinking entitlement, the absolute certainty that I, Clara, would once again pull a rabbit out of an empty hat, that finally solidified my resolve. I looked at their expectant faces I had known my entire life, and for the first time, I felt not a flicker of obligation, only a cold, clear understanding of what needed to be done. They weren't just asking me to save the estate. They were asking me to continue sacrificing my life, my future, for their comfort, for their illusions. That night, I didn't go back to the estate ledgers. I went to my cottage, opened my own books, and began to draft a very different kind of financial report. The upcoming family council, I decided, would be one they would never forget. They were expecting another plea for austerity, another carefully managed decline. They had no idea they were about to be presented with an ultimatum, one backed by an empire they didn't even know existed. My empire. The week leading up to the family council was, for me, surprisingly calm. The decision, once made, had settled a lifetime of internal turmoil. I went about my usual duties at Ashworth, tallying figures that now seemed almost comically insignificant, listening to the usual litany of complaints and demands with a new, detached amusement. Alistair was particularly agitated about a proposed land tax increase, pacing my small office and gesticulating wildly. It's an outrage, Clara. An absolute affront to families like ours who've been the backbone of this county for generations. I merely nodded, offering a non-committal. Indeed. Alistair. Troubling times. He didn't notice the glint in my eye, the almost imperceptible smile I had to suppress. He was too absorbed in his own performance of righteous indignation. Beatrice, meanwhile, was consumed with plans for a summer garden party, apparently oblivious to the fact that the estate could barely afford to mend the leaking gutters, let alone fund champagne and canapes for half the county. She'd flutter in, fabric swatches in hand, asking my opinion on color schemes for marquees. "Do you think periwinkle blue is too frivolous for an Ashworth affair, Clara? Or should we stick to the traditional cream?" I'd murmur something vaguely supportive, my mind already on the carefully prepared dossiers and financial statements locked away in my cottage. Julian, as usual, was absent, presumably pursuing his art in a city studio funded by my silent, reluctant facilitation of estate funds, a pipeline I was about to decisively cut. The day of the council arrived, a crisp autumn morning. The grand dining room, rarely used for anything other than these fraught quarterly meetings, had been aired out. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy ancestral portraits that lined the walls, stern-faced Ashworths of generations past, who I imagined would be either appalled or secretly impressed by what I was about to do. My 3 siblings were already seated around the vast, polished mahogany table when I entered, punctual as always. Alistair was drumming his fingers impatiently. Beatrice was dabbing at her temples with a lace-trimmed handkerchief, complaining of a migraine, and Julian, who'd made a rare appearance, looked bored and slightly resentful, as if his presence was a monumental imposition. "Ah, Clara, finally," Alistair boomed, his tone implying I was somehow late, though I was precisely on time. "Let's get this unpleasantness over with. What's the damage this quarter? More doom and gloom, I suppose." He attempted a hearty laugh, but it fell flat in the cavernous room. I took my usual seat, the hard, upright chair at the foot of the table, the one that always felt symbolic of my position. But today, I didn't feel like I was at the foot. Today, I felt like I was at the head, regardless of where I sat. I placed my worn leather satchel on the table, not the usual thin folder of estate accounts, but something considerably thicker, heavier. It landed with a soft, definitive thud that seemed to momentarily silence Alistair's bluster. I began, my voice even and steady. "Good morning. Before we discuss the estate's current predicament, I have a rather different financial report to present." I saw a flicker of confusion in Alistair's eyes, a slight frown from Beatrice. Julian merely sighed, probably assuming this was some new, tedious cost-cutting measure I was about to propose. I reached into the satchel and pulled out the first of several bound documents, its cover a discreet professional gray. "This," I said, sliding a copy towards each of them, "is an overview of Ashworth Holdings Limited." Alistair picked it up, a puzzled expression on his face. "Ashworth Holdings? Never heard of it. Is this some new shell company you've set up? For tax purposes, Clara? Bit elaborate, isn't it?" "Not exactly a shell company, Alistair," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "It's a diversified investment firm. My investment firm." A beat of silence. Beatrice let out a small, perplexed laugh. "Your firm, Clara? Don't be silly. What would you know about investment firms?" Julian actually looked up from his phone, a spark of curiosity in his usually indifferent eyes. I continued, my voice gaining a subtle strength. "Over the past 20 years, while managing the one decline of Ashworth Estate, I've also been rather busy building Ashworth Holdings. It currently possesses assets significantly exceeding those of the family estate. Considerably so, in fact." I let that sink in, watching their faces. Disbelief was the first wave, followed by a dawning, uncomfortable bewilderment. Alistair was the first to recover, or at least to bluster. "What on earth are you talking about, Clara? You? Building a firm? With what money? Don't be absurd. You've barely managed to keep this place from falling down around our ears." His voice was rising, a familiar tactic. I met his gaze calmly. "With my salary, Alistair, the one I earned here, and with careful, strategic investments made over 2 decades. It seems my little miracles, as you call them, extended beyond just keeping the lights on at Ashworth." I then proceeded to walk them through a summary of the holdings. The commercial real estate, the tech shares, the sustainable energy ventures, the carefully managed stock portfolio. Each slide I projected onto the wall, each figure I quoted, was like a small, precise hammer blow against the facade of their superiority. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken emotions. Beatrice looked pale, her hand fluttering to her throat. Julian was leaning forward, his earlier boredom replaced by an almost predatory interest. Alistair's face had gone from ruddy to a blotchy puce. This is preposterous, he finally spluttered. If this is true, and I highly doubt it, then this money, these holdings, they belong to the family. To the estate. You've clearly been siphoning funds. I almost smiled. It was so predictable. On the contrary, Alistair, I said, my voice like ice. Every transaction is meticulously documented, audited by an independent firm, and entirely legal. These assets were built with my own earnings, on my own time, through my own efforts. They belong to me. Clara Ashworth. Not to Ashworth Estate, nor to the Ashworth family collectively. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Beatrice's sharp intake of breath. The ground beneath their feet had not just crumbled, it had vanished. But the most surprising chapter of my journey was yet to come, kept under lock and key. Keep watching to uncover the full truth behind decades of silence. The stunned silence in the dining room stretched, heavy and suffocating. Alistair, for perhaps the first time in his life, looked utterly speechless, his mouth opening and closing like a beached fish. Beatrice seemed to have shrunk into her chair, her eyes wide and fixed on me with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Julian, however, was the first to break the spell, his voice a low, almost awed whisper. So, all this time, while you were out there doing this? He gestured vaguely at the projection of Ashworth Holdings' impressive balance sheet. There was no accusation in his tone, more a dawning, almost grudging respect. It was the first crack in their united front of entitlement. I nodded slowly. Precisely, Julian. While Ashworth Estate was, shall we say, treading water, I was building a lifeboat. A rather substantial one, as it turns out. I paused, then pressed on to the core of my presentation. Which brings us to the actual purpose of today's meeting. Ashworth Estate, as you know, is no longer financially viable in its current state. It requires a significant capital injection merely to remain solvent, let alone to restore it to any semblance of its former, or even present, dignity. I watched their faces carefully. The familiar anxiety was returning to Alistair's eyes. Beatrice looked like she might weep, and Julian was now looking at me with an intense, calculating gaze. However, I continued, my voice firm, I am prepared to offer that capital. A collective sigh of relief, almost palpable, went through them. Alistair visibly relaxed, a smug look starting to creep back onto his face. Well, there we are then, he exclaimed, a touch of his old bombast returning. Knew you wouldn't let the old place go under, Clara. Good girl. So, you'll just transfer the necessary funds from this holdings thing of yours, and we can get the West Wing sorted. Beatrice chimed in. Oh, thank goodness. I was so worried about the winter ball. I held up a hand, silencing them. There are, of course, conditions. The smugness vanished from Alistair's face as quickly as it had appeared. Conditions? He repeated, his voice tight with suspicion. What sort of conditions? I leaned forward slightly, my gaze meeting each of theirs in turn. Condition 1. I will assume full, unequivocal control of Ashworth Estate. All financial decisions, all management, all future planning will be mine alone. Your stipends will cease. Any future income from the estate will be at my discretion, based on its performance and needs, not on your perceived entitlements. Beatrice gasped. But our allowances, how are we supposed to live? Alistair slammed his hand on the table. This is outrageous. You can't just take over. This is our family home, our legacy." "It is a legacy," I countered calmly, "that you have collectively driven into the ground. I am offering to save it, not to perpetuate the mismanagement that has brought it to this point." I then laid out my second condition. Condition 2. Each of you will be offered a role within the restructured estate, should you choose to accept it. These will be actual jobs, with actual responsibilities and performance expectations. Alistair, your experience with the tenant farms, however mismanaged, could be redirected under proper supervision. Beatrice, your eye for aesthetics could be genuinely useful in overseeing the restoration and perhaps developing the estate as a heritage venue. Julian, your artistic talents might find an outlet in marketing or digital presence if you're willing to apply them practically. Alistair scoffed. You expect us to work? For you? On our own estate? Beatrice looked horrified. A job? Like a commoner? Only Julian remained quiet, thoughtfully stroking his chin, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. And if we refuse these generous offers? Alistair sneered. I met his gaze without flinching. Then Ashworth Holdings will make a competitive market offer to purchase the estate outright. You can take your share of the proceeds, which, after settling the estate's substantial debts, will be far less than you imagine, and you will be free to pursue your lives elsewhere. The estate, under my sole ownership, will then be redeveloped as I see fit, perhaps a luxury hotel, or a sustainable agricultural enterprise. The possibilities are quite extensive. The threat, or rather, the stark choice, hung in the air. The power dynamic in that room had irrevocably, seismically shifted. My quiet revolution was no longer silent. It was a declaration. Did this bold move resonate with you? If you're finding Clara's story as compelling as I hope, consider hitting that like button to show your support. It truly helps stories like this reach more people. The ensuing hour was a blur of outrage, disbelief, and frantic whispered consultations between my siblings. Alistair blustered and threatened, alternating between accusing me of treachery and appealing to my family duty. Beatrice wept, lamenting the downfall of their social standing. Julian, surprisingly, asked pointed practical questions about my business plan for the estate, about potential revenue streams, about the timelines for restoration. He wasn't agreeing, not yet, but he was engaging with the reality of the situation in a way his older siblings seemed incapable of. He saw the numbers, and unlike them, he seemed to understand what they meant. Finally, Alistair, red-faced and defeated, growled, "And what if we fight this? What if we take you to court? This is coercion." I had anticipated this. "You are welcome to try, Alistair," I said smoothly, "but I assure you, my legal team is considerably more competent than the one you last employed for your unfortunate racehorse venture. Ashworth Holdings' legal standing is impeccable. A court battle would only serve to publicly air the estate's dirty laundry and deplete what little assets remain even further. The choice, ultimately, is yours. A managed future with dignity and purpose, or a swift, unceremonious end." I sat back, allowing them to absorb the finality of it. The years of silent servitude were over. I had laid my terms on the table they had always assumed was theirs alone to command. The next move was theirs, but the game was undeniably mine. The days that followed the council meeting, as it was now grimly referred to by my siblings, were a strange mixture of simmering resentment and grudging negotiation. Alistair initially refused to speak to me, communicating only through terse third-person notes delivered by Mrs. Gable, the long-suffering housekeeper. Mr. Alistair requires clarification on point 7, subsection B of your proposal. One such note read, as if discussing a hostile corporate takeover rather than the fate of his own home. Beatrice took to her bed, claiming a nervous collapse, though I noted she still managed to issue detailed instructions regarding her dietary requirements to the kitchen staff. It was Julian, surprisingly, who became the main conduit for communication. He'd seek me out in my small office, or intercept me on my walks through the neglected gardens, his earlier cynicism replaced by a pragmatic curiosity. "So this heritage venue idea," he'd begin. "You're thinking weddings? Corporate retreats? What's the target demographic?" Or, "These sustainable agriculture plans. Are we talking organic certification? Direct-to-consumer sales?" He wasn't just asking questions. He was testing the waters, gauging the seriousness of my intent and the viability of my vision. I answered him honestly and directly, sharing aspects of my business plans, explaining the market research I'd conducted, the experts I'd already consulted. I sensed he was less concerned with the insult to the Ashworth pride, and more interested in whether my venture had a genuine chance of success. For Julian, who had always lived on the precarious edge of financial dependency, the prospect of a stable, albeit earned income, perhaps held a certain appeal. The deadline I had set for their decision loomed. I made it clear that Ashworth Holdings' offer to purchase the estate was not an idle threat. The paperwork was drawn up, ready to be executed. The pressure was mounting, and the cracks in their united front of indignation began to widen. I overheard a furious argument between Alistair and Julian in the library one evening. Alistair was still clinging to the notion of a legal challenge, of not letting Clara get away with this. Julian's voice, sharp and cutting, retorted, "Get away with what, Alistair? Saving us from ruin? Face it, she's holding all the cards. Our only choice is whether we play the hand she's dealt us, or fold and walk away with nothing but our pride and a mountain of debt." Beatrice, eventually coaxed from her smelling salts and self-pity, began to make tentative inquiries about the restoration. If one were to, hypothetically, oversee the interiors, she asked me one afternoon, her voice still laced with hauteur, would one have a budget and a degree of artistic license? I assured her that a realistic budget would be allocated, and that her expertise, if genuinely applied, would be valued, though final approval would, of course, rest with me. It was a small concession, but it was enough to see a flicker of interest in her eyes. The thought of presiding over the redecoration of Ashworth, even under my authority, was clearly more palatable than fading into impoverished obscurity. The day before the deadline, they requested a final meeting. This time it was held in the less formal morning room, the atmosphere still tense but without the overt hostility of the previous encounter. Alistair, looking older and more careworn than I had ever seen him, spoke first. "Clara," he said, his voice devoid of its usual bluster. We have discussed your proposal, at length." He paused, as if the words were physically difficult to utter. "We find ourselves in agreement with its general terms." I kept my expression neutral, though a small internal sigh of relief escaped me. This was the first hurdle cleared. "However," he continued, a touch of the old Alistair returning, "we have some suggestions regarding the allocation of roles." It turned out that Alistair did not fancy overseeing tenant farms. He envisioned himself in a more ambassadorial role, representing the Ashworth legacy at public events. Events, I noted, that would primarily involve schmoozing and minimal actual work. Beatrice, while amenable to the interior design aspect, also felt her talents would be wasted, if not also applied to curating the social calendar of the newly profitable estate. Julian, true to his emerging pragmatism, simply stated he was willing to take on the marketing and digital strategy, provided he was given the resources and autonomy to do it effectively. I listened patiently, making notes. Some of their suggestions were laughably self-serving, a desperate attempt to cling to the vestiges of their former status. Others, particularly Julian's, were more reasonable. "I will consider your input," I said when they had finished. "However, the final decisions on roles and responsibilities will be mine. Performance will be regularly reviewed, and underperformance will have consequences. This is not the old Ashworth, where sinecures were handed out based on birthright. This is a business. My business. The reminder was necessary. They needed to understand that while I was offering them a lifeline, it came with an entirely new set of rules. The power had not just shifted, it had been entirely redefined. Have you ever had to make a tough decision that changed everything for your family or your future? Sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most profound transformations. If you're invested in Clara's journey and want to see how she navigates this new dynamic, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Lawyers finalized the transfer of control. Accountants pored over the estate's convoluted finances, untangling decades of neglect. I moved out of my small cottage and into the main house, not into the Grand Master suite, which still felt alien, but into a modest set of rooms in the quieter East Wing, rooms with good light and space for my now considerably expanded office. The symbolic weight of this move was not lost on anyone, least of all my siblings. They watched, with a mixture of resentment and apprehension, as I began to implement the changes I had outlined. The first order of business was a thorough assessment of the estate's assets and liabilities. Tradesmen were brought in to quote for urgent repairs: the West Wing roof, the ancient plumbing, the crumbling stone walls of the outbuildings. My siblings, to their credit, or perhaps out of a dawning sense of self-preservation, began to tentatively engage with their new roles. Julian threw himself into developing a sleek website and social media strategy, his creative energy finally finding a productive outlet. Beatrice, after some initial resistance to budgetary constraints, surprised me with her knowledge of historical fabrics and paint colors, and her genuine passion for restoring the house's faded grandeur. Even Alistair, after a period of sullen inactivity, began to grudgingly accompany the estate manager on inspections of the farms, offering surprisingly astute observations about crop rotation and livestock, remnants of an agricultural education he'd long since dismissed as irrelevant. It was a fragile beginning, a new and uncertain chapter for all of us, built on the foundations of a secret I had guarded for so long, a secret that had now irrevocably altered all our futures. The transformation of Ashworth Estate didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, arduous process, like turning a massive, creaking ship in a new direction. There were days when the sheer scale of the task felt overwhelming: the endless repairs, the tangled legal issues left over from generations of haphazard management, and not least, the delicate dance of managing my siblings' often fragile egos. Alistair, in particular, chafed under my authority. He'd frequently try to circumvent my decisions, appealing to old family retainers or attempting to leverage his Ashworth name with local suppliers, only to be politely but firmly redirected back to me. Each instance was a small battle, a reassertion of the new order. Beatrice, once she understood that her artistic license came with accountability for budgets and timelines, proved to be surprisingly effective. Her initial foray into selecting drapes for the morning room, however, led to a minor crisis when she presented me with a quote that could have funded the entire roof repair for the stables. "But Clara, darling," she'd protested, "it's hand-woven silk from Italy. Anything less would be an insult to the room's heritage." I had to patiently explain the concept of phased restoration and prioritizing essential infrastructure over luxury finishing. It was a learning curve for her, this collision of aesthetic desire with fiscal reality. But she adapted, albeit with theatrical sighs and pronouncements about the Philistine nature of modern commerce. Julian was, in many ways, my most surprising success. Freed from the aimlessness of his previous life, he attacked his marketing role with an almost ferocious energy. He redesigned the outdated Ashworth crest into a modern, elegant logo, launched a stunning website showcasing the estate's history and future potential, and even started a blog featuring stories of Ashworth's past, cleverly weaving in hints of its revitalized future. He had a natural flair for branding and a keen understanding of how to create a narrative. "We're not just selling rooms or event spaces, Clara," he explained to me one evening, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We're selling an experience, a piece of history made relevant again. It's about aspiration, but with substance. I found myself genuinely impressed. There were, of course, moments of doubt. Late at night, alone in my new, larger office, surrounded by blueprints and financial projections, the weight of it all would sometimes press down on me. Had I been too harsh? Had I destroyed what little family connection we had left in my quest for control and solvency? But then, I would walk through the slowly improving grounds, see the newly mended fences, the carefully pruned rose gardens, the scaffolding around the west wing, and know that I was doing what needed to be done. Ashworth was breathing again, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. It was no longer a mausoleum of past glories, but a place with a future. One of the most significant changes was the atmosphere. The oppressive cloud of unspoken financial anxiety that had hung over Ashworth for decades began to lift. With bills being paid on time and a clear plan for the future, even the long-serving staff seemed to walk a little taller. Mrs. Gable, who had seen generations of Ashworths come and go, once stopped me in the hallway, a rare smile on her usually stern face. "It's good to see the old place getting some proper care, Miss Clara," she said quietly. "Your grandfather would be proud." Her words, simple and sincere, meant more to me than any financial report. The local community also began to take notice. For years, Ashworth had been a symbol of genteel decline. Now, there was a buzz of activity. Local craftsmen were employed for the restoration. Local suppliers were prioritized for goods and services. I made a point of attending village meetings, something no Ashworth had done for decades, listening to local concerns and outlining my plans for the estate to be a contributing member of the community, not just a drain on its resources. This approach, so different from my family's previous insularity, began to build bridges that had long since crumbled. The journey was far from over, but each small victory felt like a validation of the difficult choices I had made. The secret empire I had built was no longer just for me. It was now the engine driving the revival of a legacy, albeit a legacy being thoroughly reshaped. If you're enjoying seeing how Clara is navigating these complex family and business dynamics, why not share this video with someone who appreciates a story of quiet strength and transformation? A particularly telling moment came during the planning for the first major event under the new regime, a charity gala to benefit the local hospice, a cause I felt strongly about. Beatrice, naturally, was in charge of the decor and arrangements. Alistair, after some persuasion, agreed to act as a co-host, leveraging his still considerable social connections. Julian, of course, handled all the publicity and ticketing. It was the first time they had truly worked together as a team, under my overall direction, towards a common goal that wasn't solely about their own benefit. There were disagreements, of course, and moments of high drama, mostly from Beatrice, over the quality of the table linens. But on the night of the gala, as I watched them greet guests, manage logistics, and genuinely contribute to the event's success, I saw a flicker of something new, a shared sense of purpose, however fragile. The gala was a resounding success, raising a significant sum for the hospice and showcasing Ashworth in its newly polished, if not yet fully restored, glory. Afterwards, as the last guests departed, the four of us found ourselves in the library, a rare moment of shared quiet. "Well," Alistair said, surprisingly subdued. "That wasn't entirely unpleasant." Beatrice, fanning herself, actually conceded. "The floral arrangements were rather spectacular, if I do say so myself." Julian, scrolling through the positive social media buzz on his phone, just grinned. For a moment, the old resentment seemed to recede, replaced by a tired but satisfied camaraderie. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, and perhaps it never would be fully. But it was a step, a recognition that perhaps this new Ashworth, the one I was building, might have a place for all of them, if they were willing to earn it. The choice, as always, remained theirs. But I was no longer the silent, accommodating Clara. I was the architect of this new reality, and they were, finally, beginning to understand the terms of engagement. Years have passed since that pivotal family council meeting. Ashworth Estate today is unrecognizable from the decaying relic it once was. The West Wing is no longer crumbling, but houses luxurious guest suites. The gardens are meticulously maintained, a vibrant tapestry of color and scent. The tenant farms are profitable, practicing sustainable agriculture under Alistair's surprisingly adept, if sometimes grumbling, supervision. He found a new purpose, not as the lord of the manor, but as a respected land manager, his deep-rooted knowledge of the estate finally put to good use. He even started a small artisanal cheese-making venture on the side, which, to everyone's surprise, including his own, is gaining a reputation. Beatrice, after a few initial clashes over budgets, blossomed as the creative director of Ashworth. Her eye for detail and her understanding of historical aesthetics transformed the interiors into spaces of breathtaking beauty, attracting high-end weddings, corporate retreats, and even film crews. She discovered a talent for event management she never knew she possessed, and the Ashworth experience, as Julian branded it, became synonymous with elegance and impeccable service. She still laments the necessity of vulgar commerce occasionally, but the pride she takes in the glowing reviews and the estate's thriving social calendar is undeniable. She found her stage, and she performs on it with gusto. Julian, my pragmatic, once cynical younger brother, became the indispensable COO of Ashworth Holdings, which now officially encompasses the estate. His sharp business acumen and innovative marketing strategies propelled us into new markets, expanding our portfolio beyond what I had ever initially envisioned. He travels extensively, negotiating deals, and always returns with fresh ideas and an infectious enthusiasm. We became partners in the truest sense, our skills complementing each other. The boy who once drifted aimlessly now chairs board meetings with confidence and foresight. He found his ambition, and it burns brightly. And me? I am Clara Ashworth, CEO of Ashworth Holdings. I am no longer the silent cog, the overlooked daughter. I am the woman who saved her family's legacy by dismantling their illusions and rebuilding it on a foundation of reality, hard work, and mutual respect. Or at least, earned respect. My days are still long, filled with decisions and responsibilities, but there is a profound satisfaction in seeing the fruits of my labor, not just in the balance sheets, but in the revitalized land and the changed lives of those around me, including my own. My relationship with my siblings is complex. It's not the idyllic family portrait some might imagine. The scars of the past are still there, faint lines beneath the surface of our new dynamic. There are still moments of tension, echoes of old resentments. But there is also a new understanding. They see me now not just as their sister or the dependable Clara, but as the woman who possessed the vision and the will they lacked. They might not always like my decisions, but they respect them because they have seen the results. We don't always have cozy family dinners, but we have productive board meetings. We don't always agree, but we communicate, often robustly. Perhaps this is what a real family business looks like, stripped of sentimentality and forced to confront its own truths. The empire I built in secret is now out in the open, a testament to what can be achieved with quiet determination and a refusal to accept a preordained, diminishing fate. The greatest gift, perhaps, has been the peace I found within myself. The burden of that decades-long secret, the constant double life, is gone. I walk through Ashworth now not as its servant, but as its steward, its architect. And when I look out from my office window, the same east-facing window from that old linen closet, now part of a spacious modern office in the restored main house, I no longer see just untamed gardens and looming debts. I see potential realized, a future secured, a legacy not just preserved but reinvented. It wasn't the path I ever envisioned for myself growing up in the shadow of Ashworth's grandeur, but it is a path I forged with my own hands, my own mind. My story isn't one of fairy tale revenge or instant forgiveness. It's a story about the slow, difficult work of transformation, of a place, of a family, and ultimately, of a self. It's about understanding that sometimes, to save something precious, you have to be willing to risk it all, to challenge the comfortable lies, and to demand a new reality. The quiet strength I cultivated in silence became the audible voice of change, and that, I've learned, is a power far more valuable than any inheritance. What hidden strengths do you possess that the world, or even your own family, has yet to see? Reflect on that, and perhaps, like me, you'll find the courage to bring them into the light. If my journey has struck a chord with you, or made you think about the unspoken dynamics in your own life, please consider leaving a comment. Your stories and reflections are what build a community around these shared experiences. The ledgers I keep are still meticulous, but now there is only one set, detailing the thriving enterprise that is Ashworth. The other ledger, the secret one, is now just a historical document, a reminder of a past I have transcended. The annual family council meetings are still held in the grand dining room, but they are very different now. They are strategy sessions, filled with robust debate, innovative ideas, and a shared commitment to the future. My siblings no longer look to me to perform little miracles. They bring their own contributions to the table, earned through effort and expertise. And as I sit at the head of that table, not by default, but by right, I know that the most valuable asset I ever built wasn't financial. It was the hard-won respect and the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I, Clara Ashworth, had finally, truly, come into my own.